Welcome to Crosspoint.
Welcome to Crosspoint.
Welcome to Crosspoint.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition
that's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
That we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family.
Regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
How great this love, oh, it's moving all my mountains. This perfect love is casting out my fear. How great this love, oh, it welcomes me like family, and everywhere I go, it meets me there. He is good, and He is God. What I earn is not what I got. He is just, yet oh so kind. What I deserve is not what I find. What more could I say about Him? My God is love. How great this love, oh, it's faithful through my failures. This trusted love is with me to the end. How great this love, oh, it's closer than a brother. This is love, He died so I could live. He is good, and He is God. What I earn is not what I got. He is just, yet oh so kind. What I deserve is not what I find. What more could I say about Him? My God is love. He is good, and He is God. what I earned, is not what I got. He is just, yet oh so kind. What I deserve is not what I find. What more could I say about him? My God is love. What more could I say about him? My God is love. What more could I say about him? My God is love. Restoring me the joy of our salvation. Take me back to where it all began, where all I've ever wanted was your presence. How I long to be there once again. Light a fire that the world can't burn out, fan a flame till nothing between us remains. Oh, my life is an altar to you. Breathe again on the embers that burn in my heart. I love taking back to the start. My life is an altar to you. Renew in me a pure and willing spirit. Take me back to where it all began. Before it all became so complicated. How I long to be there once again. Light a fire that the world can't burn out, fan a flame till nothing between us remains. My life is an altar to you. Breathe again on the embers that burn in my heart. I love taking back to the start. My life is an altar to you. God, I'm sorry. Please forgive me for when I've gone cold. Lord, I need you. How I need you to awake my soul. Light a fire that the world can't burn out, fan a flame till nothing between us remains. My life is an altar to you. Breathe again on the embers that burn in my heart. I love taking back to the start. My life is an altar to you. God, I'm sorry. Please forgive me for when I've gone cold. Lord, I need you. How I need you to awake my soul.
Hi, Crosspoint. There are a few opportunities coming up that I would like to make you aware of. First, today is the last day to sign up for spring small groups. There are lots of options available. This season, all groups are virtual, and they range from one-time book discussions or podcast discussions, parenting classes, Bible classes, to ongoing classes. So I invite you to check them out online at crosspoint.org/groups. It's a great way to dive a little deeper and to meet new people. One of these ongoing opportunities is for a group for anyone who is male identifying. Steve Doherty leads a weekly discussion for men of any description and background, and it's called Wake Up Man. It meets via Zoom every Wednesday morning from 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. And for the next 7 weeks, they're discussing chapter by chapter the book The Bible Tells Me So by Professor Pete Enns. You don't have to sign up, you just need to show up at 7 a.m. having read or even skimmed the chapter. There's always good conversation that follows. They just started the book, and this coming Wednesday, the 19th, they'll be discussing chapter 2, so there's not too much to catch up on. And as a bonus, when you're finished with the book, the group gets to hang out on May 31st with Professor Pete Enns and ask him all the questions you wanted to ask a Bible scholar who can talk like a regular person. You can find out more, and you can get the link at crosspoint.org/adults. And as always, if acquiring a book or materials for a study is ever an obstacle, just let us know and we'll gladly remove that barrier for you. Second, we have had some wonderful work days recently with our partnership with Habitat for Humanity Wake and the Interfaith Coalition. We've also recently completed a home restoration project for one of our neighbors. Thank you for everyone who is involved. There are several more opportunities coming up for you to plug in. If you're 16 or older, you can join us on May 29th, May 6th, and May 20th, or May 20th, to help complete construction on some homes for our neighbors. You don't have to have construction experience. You just need to be willing to work with others to help build a home. For families or anybody under 16, there's the opportunity to participate in the Baffle Project on April 30th. These are cardboard pieces that go into the roofline, and this project decorates them with art, encouraging words, prayers, before they're put up and covered with the ceiling. Thanks again to everyone who's been able to participate, and I hope that more of us can get involved. You can find out more. You can register at crosspoint.org/habitat. Then we are also so grateful and excited to have been able to share and implement our new Crosspoint community policies and guidelines for all of our volunteers and staff. It gives us just another way to live out our goal of living like Christ and creating a safe place where everyone who engages with Crosspoint feels that they can attend. If you are a volunteer, I want to remind you of the 2 virtual workshops coming up Wednesday, April 19th, Thursday, April 27th, both from 7 to 9 p.m., and they are required for anyone wanting to volunteer. We will get some great insight on these trainings with it's being led by our consultant, Heather Emery, and it's an opportunity to put our policies and guidelines into practice. And it also just helps us grow and learn as individuals and as a community. So if you're a volunteer and you haven't gotten an email about this, please let me know at community@crosspoint.org. And as always, Crosspoint, if you want to partner with us financially, you can find multiple ways to do that at crosspoint.org/contribute. Have a great, great week.
So last week, at the very end of our second in-person Easter service, I stood up on stage as we were getting ready to dismiss, and I just had this unplanned moment where I wanted to acknowledge that being in that space was just encouraging to me. Seeing people showing up to be a part of a better, more loving story in the world, it just reminded me that there's a lot of good going on. Because when you see the headlines on the various news feeds, by design, they're almost always intended to spark outrage and anger, disgust, and sadness. They just are. That's what drives viewers and clicks, bashing people, demonizing people. And because that's how the game is played, it's easy to believe that's all there is in the world. Sometimes it's all we allow ourselves to see. And so what I've experienced myself and hear from a lot of other people is that a lot of us are just tired and sad and frustrated. And it can feel like at times, like, what's the point? Is this thing that we all do together, is it even worth it? So I want to wrestle with those ideas a bit further today. Now, here's the thing. I'm not going to try to sell myself or sell any of you on any definitive answers, but I do want us to sit with some history. I want to look at one of the most feared texts in the Bible and then see what being reminded of people's stories from 2,000 years ago may do in you and I today. So, where modern Turkey sits today was the ancient city of Ephesus. Now, here's a glimpse of some of the ruins. Ephesus was part of the Roman Empire, but was located at the far eastern edge, and so it served as a bridge city between the western world of Europe and the eastern world of Asia. And so as a result, it became the main marketplace for buying and selling in the ancient world, where people from the West would come to buy items from Asia that they didn't otherwise have, things like silks and spices and various fabrics. And this main marketplace in Ephesus was known as the Agora. Now, Roman Caesars at the time were believed to be gods on earth, and it was demanded that those in the Roman Empire worship them as such. And so one of the ways that this was enforced was that in order to buy and sell in the Agora, the marketplace in Ephesus, you first had to make an offering of worship to the Caesar. So at the entrance to the marketplace, they would have stands where you could make an incense offering to the Caesar, acknowledging the Caesar as God. Then, once you made the offering, then you were allowed to buy and sell. And so, with reflection, a natural question becomes, well, how could you tell then in a crowded marketplace who was actually making the offering or not? How could you tell who was actually loyal to Caesar and who wasn't? Well, a lot of scholars and historical evidence points to that there was this kind of stamp made with ink that would be put on the person's hand or on their face. It was known in Greek as the charagma. And it was this stamp, this charagma, that would indicate to various vendors that this person was allowed to buy and sell in the marketplace because they had declared that Caesar was Lord and therefore had the stamp. So one could imagine the difficult position early followers of Jesus in the first century found themselves in. They had to wrestle with, if I want to buy and sell goods, do I take the charagma or not? Because imagine, if you're a blacksmith, if you have 3 or 4 kids and you bring your tools to the Agora, and selling these tools is the way you feed your family, but you've also chosen to follow Jesus, to give yourself to Jesus' view of the world and claim Jesus as Lord. And so you show up at the Agora to buy and sell and you're told, wait, you don't have the charagma. You don't have the ink stain on your hand. You got to go back to the altar and declare allegiance to Caesar's kingdom first, to worship Caesar as God first. So what do you do? I mean, what does the seamstress do? What's the farmer do? Because the thought process has to be, I need to provide for my family. So do I take the mark or not? Do I declare my loyalty to Caesar as Lord or not? And understand, that's a legitimate question, right? This isn't like, oh, if you're really a follower of Jesus, the answer would be so easy. No, this was a real practical, stressful tension in the first century for those trying to figure out how to navigate following Jesus in their context and in their world. Now, I want to give you a little more context on 2 particular Caesars who shaped this environment in the first century. One was Nero. He ruled from 54 AD to 68 AD. And Nero was the Caesar who first started the intense persecution of Christians in the first century of Rome. Some of you may remember from history class that in 64 Common Era, there was what was known as the Great Fire of Rome, where Rome burned for 6 days, destroying nearly 70% of the city. And eventually the word on the street became that it was actually Nero who started the fire. Many scholars believe that Nero suffered from mental illness, but once those rumors started to circulate, Nero attempted to deflect blame off himself, and he began to point to Christians as the one who started the fire, to point the finger at them. And at the end of 64 Common Era, began a public campaign to make Christians enemies of the Roman Empire. And the persecution went to such extremes that different historical accounts record Nero dipping Christians in oil, lighting them on fire, and using them as torches to illuminate his gardens at night. Now, Nero's systematic and focused persecution against Christians lasted 3.5 years until a coup was staged to overthrow Nero in June of 68 Common Era. But before he could be taken, Nero committed suicide, putting a sword up through his throat and into his head. Now, long after Nero died, a legend started to grow that Nero would return, that he would be reincarnated somehow. The fear of what Nero was capable of only furthered the rumor, so much so that you can actually find documentation of this legend for about 400 years after Nero's death. Then, toward the end of the first century, another Caesar rose to power named Domitian, and he ruled from 81 to 96 CE. Domitian didn't practice now a systematic persecution against Christians like Nero did. He wasn't making up conspiracy theories about them and actively hunting them down to slaughter them like Nero did for those 3.5 years, but it was more like, hey, just everybody fall in line. Don't make any waves and you'll be fine. But if you do push back, if you do resist, then there's going to be problems. In this one picture, you can see Domitian holding a scroll. And the scroll served as a symbol that his words and orders carried all the weight and authority to rule over the world. It was this sign and symbol of power. Now, history recounts that Domitian was kind of a rather round and obese man. But since most of the Roman Empire would never see you in person, if you're going to commission statues of yourself, well, you might as well present yourself to the world with six-pack abs, right? So that's what he does. Now, Domitian possessed similar frightening characteristics as Nero, so much so that he was given the name Nero Redivivus, which meant Nero reborn. Now, Domitian had similar psychotic tendencies. Once in 90 AD, Domitian held a dinner party for a crowd of high-ranking couples at his palace. The guests were ushered into a room decorated entirely in black, and at the table setting in front of each person, he had prepared a gravestone with the guest's name engraved on it. Now, to make it even more disturbing, he had boys walk out naked, painted completely in black from head to toe, to serve the meal to the guest. Then he had the food even dyed black and served on black plates, and then Domitian spent the evening speaking about the inevitability of death and decay. Now, this was obviously before he could get better ideas off of Pinterest, but this is how he did it. This is how Domitian was. He controlled people with fear and intimidation. He didn't hesitate to kill anyone who threatened him, whether they were a Christian or not, didn't matter. Now, Domitian decided to build his temple in the city of Ephesus. It was a massive structure that stood at the gateway of the city of the world. And on top of the temple, there was a platform with a 27-foot statue of Domitian. Part of that statue remains to this day, and you can just see how massive it is when you compare it to the size of the adult in this picture, 27 feet. And so this statue stood on top of the temple, and if you had come up from the sea into Ephesus, the first thing you'd see is this statue reminding you that Domitian is Lord of heaven and earth. In fact, as one more way to illustrate that, carved inside each of the columns were statues of the various Greek and Roman gods like Zeus and Hermes and Apollo. The design of the temple itself was a statement that Domitian stood on the back of all these other gods and that he reigned as the most high among them all. Now, during Domitian's reign, he also brought to Rome an Olympic-style games that happened every 4 years where tens of thousands of people would gather. And as part of these games, there were chariot races where each of the 4 horses in the races wore different colors to symbolize the different regions that they were from. Not only did they compete in the games, but this was also an opportunity to cement people's loyalty to Domitian. And so as part of the ceremony, there would be priests dressed in white robes, wearing crowns of gold on their head, and they would lead the thousands who were gathered there in songs, worshiping Domitian as he sat on the throne in the arena, praising him as Lord and God over all of heaven and earth. This was life under Domitian. And this was life near the end of the first century in Rome. However, Domitian had a problem. There was a small group of people in the corner of his empire that refused to fall in line, bow down to him and his way of ruling the world. They resisted. And they had a pastor named John, who was their leader. And so rather than kill him and make him an iconic figure that they could rally around, Domitian had John exiled to an island called Patmos. And so this leader, John, decides to write a letter to these first century followers of Jesus in Rome to encourage them. And a copy of that letter is preserved in the Bible in the letter known as Revelation. So, with all that context, I want to read to you a bit of this letter. But first, there's a few filters that we have to keep in mind, okay? This author of Revelation, John, he's an ancient Middle Eastern Jewish writer in the first century, where it was extremely common for writers to communicate in pictures and metaphors and poetry. And John's purpose in writing this letter is to encourage followers of Jesus in the midst of severe persecution in Rome that they had lived under for decades. So much so, if these followers of Jesus got caught with a letter clearly calling out the Caesars in the Roman Empire, they had plenty of evidence that they could be tortured and killed for it. So strategically, John has to communicate in code, in pictures, in metaphors that weren't quickly identifiable as threats to Caesar and to Rome. Now, it's also important to understand that there was a particular genre of writing called apocalyptic writing in the ancient Jewish and early Christian world. Whereas part of it, numbers were almost always symbolic of something else. They were rarely literal. Furthermore, it was common practice that authors would refer to anyone who set themselves up in direct opposition to God and the purposes of God as a beast or a dragon. You see this in and outside of the Bible in all sorts of different literature. And so those terms served as often coded language for various Caesars and the rulers of the Roman Empire. So with all that context, let's look at some of this letter. And let's start with one of the, if not the most feared passages in all of the Bible in recent times. Revelation chapter 13. The author John here, he's describing a vision. He's painting a picture that he invites the reader to take to heart. And he writes this to fellow first century Jesus followers in Rome. It goes like this. And I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had 10 horns with 7 heads and 10 crowns on his horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was astonished and followed the beast. Men worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshipped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can make war against him?" The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise his authority for 42 months. So, let's pause there for a moment, okay? John writes that there was a beast who seemed to have a fatal head wound. Because again, remember how Nero committed suicide, right? Put a sword through his throat up into his head. But because of all the rumors that were circulating, it was still who seemed to have died. And this beast, John writes, started making up stories and exercised his authority for 42 months. Now, history tells us, outside of the Bible, that Caesar Nero's systematic hunting down of the torture of Christians lasted 3.5 years, from the fire that destroyed Rome to Caesar Nero's death when the coup happened. So, how many months is 3.5 years? 42, right? So if you're a follower of Jesus in the first century, it's pretty clear from the jump who John's talking about. Still, John continues. He opened his mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. He was given power to make war against the saints and to conquer them, and he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation, and all inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. He who has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to go into captivity he will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword he will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. Now notice what else he says here. Verse 11. Then I saw another beast coming out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. He exercised all the authority of the first beast, and on his behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. So, hit the pause button again, okay? John says, then there's another leader who seemed like the first beast, whose fatal head wound had been healed. Because, again, Nero died of a head wound, right? But remember that Domitian was also referred to as Nero reborn. It was a commonly embraced legend at the time that Nero had been reincarnated as Domitian. And so because of this legend floating around, many people referred to Domitian as Nero. John keeps writing. Verse 13, and he performed great and miraculous signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in full view of men. Because of the signs he was given power to do on behalf of the first beast, he deceived the inhabitants of the earth. He ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. Pause button again. Remember the 27-foot statue of Domitian that dominated the landscape of Ephesus. This was the towering image that everyone would have been familiar with. He continues. He was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that it could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. He also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead. So no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. So, okay. That should definitely be ringing a bell, right? Now, this English word mark, where it says no one could buy or sell unless they had the mark, that English word mark is translated from a word in the original Greek, and that word is the charagma. John is saying this beast forced everyone, rich and poor, slave and free, to receive the charagma, the stamp, the mark on his right hand or forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. Now pay attention to what he writes next. This calls for wisdom, John says. If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is man's number. His number is 666. Dun, 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 right? The number that so many of us were taught to fear growing up, the fear of satanic barcodes being placed on your forehead, and this scary number at the root of fantastical claims pointing to this verse in the Bible without any consideration to the actual historical context it was written in. John writes, this calls for wisdom. If you're paying attention, calculate the number of the beast. It's 666. Now, in the Greek and Hebrew languages, there was a numeric coding system known as gematria. You can just Google it later on if you want to, where specific letters in ancient alphabets were assigned numerical values. Each letter had its own numerical value. So here's where it gets especially interesting. In Greek, if you add up the numerical values of the Greek letters in the name Caesar Nero, you get 1005. So this would have been written in Greek. If you take the name Caesar Nero and you add up the letters and the numerical values, you get 1005. But if you calculate the letters of his name in Hebrew, the language of these first Christians, you get the number 666. Again, John tells the reader, this calls for wisdom and insight. Because again, remember who John's writing to. He's writing to Hebrew Christians in the middle of a Greek culture. And so when he says this calls for wisdom, this calls for insight, think through this before you calculate the number. It would make sense that he calculates the number in Hebrew as a way of trying to protect these early Jewish Christians in case they were caught by Romans with possession of this letter. Now, if this is new information to you, rest assured it's not actually new information from a biblical scholarship standpoint. The way people talk about some scary 666 number and barcodes, that's very new in recent and modern day times, like the last 100, 150 years. But for us, it feels very common, like, oh, this is the thing. But if you just want to confirm what I'm talking about here, just Google on your own later, the Latin Vulgate, which was the original translation of the Bible done in Latin around the year 400. And in that first Latin translation, St. Jerome, who is the translator, doesn't include the number 666 in this verse. Instead, he translates it as 616. Because the numerical values of the Latin letters in the name Caesar Nero, which Latin had gematria as well, is 616. 616. You see, ancient Christians understood this, that this number was referring to Nero. That's how they translated it. It wasn't some frightening, futuristic, mystical, demonic symbol. John was writing to a specific group of people in a specific historical context, and he was making clear, okay, this is who we're talking about here. Now, with that said, I tend to lean with many scholars that John is actually referencing Domitian here, but he was referring to him as many of John's readers would have believed him to be at the time, which was Nero reborn, the reincarnation of Nero. Because one, it fits the time frame that most scholars believe the letter was written in, and because second, of what we read in the earlier parts of the letter of Revelation. Now, obviously, there's not time to kind of walk all the way through it, but I do want to briefly walk us through one scene John is painting earlier in the letter. particularly with the context we looked at earlier with Domitian and the Olympic-style games that were being held. And as we walk through this, I don't want to get bogged down in all the kind of minutest of details. I want you to pay attention to the overall scene and consider the big point that's being made to the followers of Jesus in Rome that John was writing to. So John writes this, Revelation chapter 4 and 5. He says, "At once I was in the Spirit, and there before me was a throne in heaven, with someone sitting on it. And the one who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian. A rainbow resembling an emerald encircled the throne. Surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones, and seated on them were 24 elders. They were dressed in white and had crowns of gold on their heads. In the center around the throne there were 4 living creatures, and they were covered with eyes in the front and in the back. Whenever the living creatures give glory, honor, and thanks to him who sits on the throne and who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. They lay their crowns before the throne and they say, 'You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being.' Then I saw on the right hand of him who sat on the throne a scroll with writing on both sides, and sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming in a loud voice, 'Who is worthy to break the seals and to open the scroll?' But no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth could open the scroll or even look inside it. I wept and wept because no one was found who was worthy to open the scroll or to look inside. Then one of the elders said to me, 'Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals.' And then I saw a lamb, looking as if it had been slain, standing in the center of the throne, encircled by the 4 living creatures and the elders. He had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. He came and took the scroll from the right hand of him who sat on the throne. And when he had taken it, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. Each one had a harp, and they were holding golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song. You, this slain lamb, this nickname for Jesus, you are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slain, and your blood you purchased men for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests to serve our God, and they will reign on the earth. And then I looked and heard the voice of many angels, numbering thousands upon thousands and 10,000 times 10,000s. They encircled the throne and the living creatures and the elders, and in a loud voice they sang, 'Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and praise.' And then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and on the sea and all that is in them singing, 'To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be praise and honor and glory and power forever and ever.' And the 4 living creatures said, 'Amen.' And the elders fell down and worshiped." So, here's what I want to encourage us to take away from this. John, he's writing to these first century followers of Jesus who are tired, they're scared, they're worn out. They feel like they just want to throw in the towel and give up on it all, because after all, they're up against huge, powerful systems that were designed to keep those with the most power and most money in control. They were up against people who used fear and threat to get their way, who would come up with conspiracy theories and propaganda and narratives to make people feel afraid of those who were different and who didn't fall in line. And no matter how hard they tried to live out a different way, this way of love and inclusion, this way of Jesus, it just didn't feel like maybe that it was making that much of a dent in their world, and they were tired. And then their leader gets exiled to another island. They get disconnected. This is the group of people that John was writing to. And what John seems to want them to know by painting this picture that parallels these Olympic Games that Domitian ran and where everything centered around Domitian. He paints this elaborate scene, this elaborate picture that would have been very familiar, and then he replaces it with another scene. It It's as if John's saying, listen, I know that so much of what you see around you right now is telling you that Rome is ultimately in power. That Rome and its ways and its Caesars sit on the throne of the universe. But God's given me a glimpse of what's actually true. That your trust and your faith in Jesus and God's kingdom and in God's vision for the world, this way of love and inclusion and generosity, it's not in vain. It's not. So don't give up. There's one scholar and author, Brian K. Blunt. He says this. He says, when you and I today don't see the practical implications of this book of Revelation for how we live today in our context, and instead make it out to try to be about some futuristic fantasy novel, it might be attributed to the fact that we're a part of the privileged part of society. That we're kind of in charge, that we kind of run things. But it's important to understand that marginalized people may see it differently. Because again, this is who the letter of Revelation was written to. It was written to those who were under threat, who were on the underside of power. And so John is encouraging them to persist in their resistance, to not give up, to remind them that it does matter. It is worth it. And so if you and I, if we want to find ourselves participating in that same kind of story today, if we want to make this letter of Revelation practical to our day-to-day lives today, I think it serves as a compelling reminder that using our voice and our energy and our time and our resources to advocate for God's vision of all humankind and to non-violently resist systems and practices that are contrary to that it does, in fact, matter. That it's worth it. Even when so much of what we see around us may seem like that it's not making much of a difference in the moment. And just to be really clear on this, I'm not talking about the kind of vision for the world that many loud, arrogant voices today claim is God's vision for the world. A vision that looks absolutely nothing like the actual life Jesus lived, where it's about trying to dominate others and argue them into your specific religious beliefs. And if they don't align with you, then you try to eradicate them with your words or your threats or your weapons. Where people weaponize the Bible and claim superiority over those who disagree and use fear and shame to try to bully and intimidate people. Friends, don't be mistaken. That's just a modern version of Nero and Domitian's Rome. And people using the name of Jesus as a prop to try to gain and maintain power and control today. Because again, that looks nothing like Jesus' actual life and how he lived, what he taught, and what he did. So here's the last thing that I'll share. I think for you and I today, the haragma that many of us have to wrestle with whether to take or not, is more about just the mark of cynicism, right? The mark of apathy or of bitterness, where it just becomes easier to quit caring, to convince ourselves that this is just how it's always going to be, because frankly, it just becomes easier that way. It's just more convenient. It's less of a hassle. And frankly, maybe if you're in a position of comfort, it's easy to do that. So I hope what we're reminded of today, it's okay to be tired and frustrated. But I hope we find ways to keep trusting and advocating for a better, more beautiful vision for the world that Christ is inviting us all toward and to participate in, where we advocate for love and peace and justice, racial justice, gender justice, economic justice, justice for our LGBTQ plus siblings, that we advocate for a world that recognizes that the value of the image of God in all people, and we resist the ideas that act in a contradiction to that. Again, we resist nonviolently, and we do so without hate, but because we don't use the same tools of the oppressors, but still we resist. And we do so creatively. And we do so together. Which is why I continue to find this ancient letter that John writes so compelling, because he's able to creatively use imagery and metaphor to paint a picture of how things were at the time, and in that way, push against it. But then, he also chose to paint a picture of something better, something more beautiful, something more aligned with the vision that God and that Jesus brought to the world. He chose to be a voice of hope and a voice of encouragement. And Crosspoint, here's to all of us together trying to do the same. You're loved.
If you would like to know more or get connected to Crosspoint, go to crosspoint.org. If you're in need of care or assistance, go to crosspoint.org/care. And welcome home.